In the first video in the free flow series, I showed you how emissions are coming out about 60 gigaton a year. In the second episode, I'm going to show you how those build up over time, over centuries, and heat the planet up. Let's get this video started. Science tells us what temperature the planet will be based on the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. To make this simpler, climate scientists have set carbon budgets that say you emit this much carbon, you're going to get this much temperature rise. Let's look at how these carbon budgets stack up in these Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. That's the IPCC. The first carbon budget we have is for 1C, and it's about 2,230 gigatons. We already passed that in 2017. The next budget was 1.5C, and that's what we're headed towards right now. We should reach 2,600 gigatons in 2023. Now, it's the emissions in the future that will determine when we go to 1.5C or 3 and 4 Fahrenheit rises. I'm going to zoom in on these carbon budgets now. I've labeled the 1C, 1.5C, and 2C. For Americans' convenience, I've added the 2 Fahrenheit, 3 Fahrenheit, and 4 Fahrenheit on the left side of the scale. From the last chart, you may remember that we have 2,600 gigatons in 2023. The question is, where do we go from here? This IPCC graphic shows increases up to 5C or around 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. I look at 3 scenarios on this graph. The first one is a high emissions scenario where we continue to increase global emissions by about 1 gigaton a year, and we'll surpass 1.5C or 2.7 F around before 2030. The second scenario is a medium emission scenario. If we start cutting down some coal plants and keep deploying renewable energy, we'll reach 1.5C still about 2035. And the low emission scenario, which is the net zero by 2050, we won't even reach 1.5C. But we're not going to do that, just according to how people are burning everything up right now. 2,600 gigatons by 2023. The world's already heated up 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's just going to keep getting higher. Let's look at what happens when the temperature rises 3 or 4 degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but it has a big impact. They look at 4 scenarios of 1.5C, 2C, 3C, and 4C rise. For Fahrenheit lovers, I've added the scale below the thermometer here. Basically, you can just double the changes in Celsius. So 1.5 goes to 3, 2 goes to 4. We're going to get to that 1.5C around 2030, it looks like. When the average temperature goes up by 3 or 4 Fahrenheit, the hottest day of the year goes up 4 or 8 Fahrenheit. About twice of what the average is what your new hottest day will be. Look at the scale of this chart. The crimson is up to 13 degrees Fahrenheit higher. So when we go to 6 and 7 degrees hotter, it's going to be up to 13 degrees hotter in the Arctic. It's insane. The Amazon is just going to burn up. When we look at soil moisture change, this drastically affects the crops all around the world. So when it gets drier in southern Spain and northern Africa, it's going to just crush the agricultural industries there. If these trends continue to 3C and 4C rise, look at the extremes of the soil moisture. It's going to dry up most of the Amazon basin, and the Congo is going to get wetter. Maybe we can grow some wheat in Saudi Arabia then. When we look at the wettest day precipitation, we see the Congo getting a lot wetter, which means worse floods. When we go to the latter part of the century, when we get 3 or 4C rise, flooding in certain areas is just going to be extreme. The Congo, what happened in Pakistan last year could be a minor flood compared to what's coming. Hotter, drier, wetter in storms, houses destroyed, floods, droughts. It's going to be really hard on the planet, and millions of people are going to have to move, and crops failures, mass migrations. It's going to be chaos. Let's look at our future according to IPCC. This IPCC graphic shows how the temperature keeps increasing, but from 1900 up to 2100. Now, we already know what it is to 2020. We got a 2 Fahrenheit rise. You can see the scale on the lower left, and the blue text is in Fahrenheit. So the darker colors go up to 7 degrees warmer. Now, based on what emission scenario, they've run hundreds of these simulations, they can see with very high emissions, it's going to raise over 7 degrees. If we lower to net zero by 2050, well, it's going to even start decreasing if we can capture more emissions in the end. Now, I like the graphics on the bottom where basically you have a boomer in the bottom chart born 1950. By the time they're 70 in 2020, they're going to not see that big of an impact. Anybody living in 2050 is going to start seeing major impacts if we keep continuing on the path we're at. And then if you're born in 2020, by 2090, it's going to be rough out there. It's going to be really hot, or it can be cool, depending on what our future emissions are. We do have the ability to change still. Boomers are going to get off pretty easy. Gen Xers like me, well, if we live to 2050, we're going to see a lot more pain too, but I mean, people are already suffering all over the world. How much is it going to take before we do something? How much is it going to take before people just vote for the future? We know what's going to happen. What are we going to do about it? Only 23% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted in the 2022 election. Millions of people could have swung elections, and we could have a lot more effective government fighting for the climate. In the third episode of the Free Flow series, I'll show you how we can take action to reduce emissions and act collectively to turn this crazy carbon train around. See you there. I'm Scott Kipp, and I want to make videos you're interested in. So leave me comments and let me know what you want to know. And subscribe. Care for the future. Vote for the future.